The Pacific Northwest in the summer of 1996 was a postcard of jade green forests and endless blue sky, a perfect backdrop for the kind of freedom that only five friends on the cusp of adulthood can truly understand. It was the height of their youth, distilled into one final, defiant road trip before college degrees demanded a more serious devotion. They called themselves the North Coast Five. 20-year-old Ethan Hayes, the pragmatic driver. His girlfriend, Clara Vance, the meticulous planner. Maya Chun, the aspiring photographer, always documenting the world. And the inseparable pair of brothers, Liam and Owen Donnelly, whose easy laughter could fill a cavern. They were headed south from Seattle, a well-trod path down Highway 101, their destination the ancient, towering majesty of the California redwoods. They never arrived. For the first 3 days, the trip was a symphony of small-town diners, peeling motel signs, and endless stretches of winding asphalt. They logged their progress on an oversized, folded map, marking the coastal towns with a cheerful red pen. Their communication with the outside world was sporadic, a charming inconvenience in a pre-ubiquitous cell phone era. A brief, crackling voicemail left for Ethan's mother on a Thursday evening was the last definitive proof of their existence. A 20-second clip of their buoyant voices overlaid with the static of a remote phone booth. Then, the silence began. The initial concern was mild, the kind of worry reserved for delayed travelers. They were young, perhaps extending their adventure, maybe simply out of range. But as Friday bled into Saturday, and Saturday surrendered to the heavy, rain-scented air of Sunday, the casual anxiety curdled into a cold, visceral dread. The families, who had initially laughed off the lack of contact, were now united by a singular, suffocating fear. This was not a spontaneous detour. This was not a broken phone. 5 young lives, full of promise and noise, had been swallowed whole by the seemingly benign wilderness of the Olympic Peninsula. The first major break came not from a sophisticated investigative effort, but from the simple, tireless vigilance of a highway patrolman on a routine sweep. Trooper Dale Kessler had driven the same 40-mile stretch of the 101 1,000 times, and he knew when something did not belong. On Monday afternoon, deep within the tangled borders of the Olympic National Forest, with the logging roads ribboned off the main highway like forgotten scars, Kessler spotted it. Tucked barely 20 feet off the gravel track, half hidden by a thicket of second-growth fir, sat a 1988 Ford Bronco. It was muddy, battered by the back roads it had traveled, yet otherwise intact. It was the North Coast Five's chariot, now their silent tomb of evidence. The scene, when the first wave of investigators arrived, was a study in frustrating contradiction. The truck's engine was cold. The ignition key was gone. But the doors, which the search team fully expected to find flung open in panic, were locked. Ethan Hayes had always been fastidious about locking his vehicle, a mundane habit now imbued with sinister meaning. The windows were up. There were no signs of forced entry, no shattered glass, no visible struggle in the surrounding underbrush. It was as if the 5 young people had simply vanished into the clear air, leaving behind the only physical tether to their journey. The silence of the forest was absolute, a deafening contrast to the vibrant, messy life that had so recently occupied the small vehicle. Every investigator felt the emotional weight of this space. They knew, with a sinking certainty that bypassed logical deduction, that the story of the North Coast Five did not end with a cheerful walk into the woods. The Bronco was a witness, and it was telling a terrifying story, but they hadn't yet learned to speak its language. The narrative had begun with a carefree journey, but now a dark and heavy curtain had descended upon the case. The vehicle sat there, abandoned, a stark and desolate monument to 5 unfulfilled futures. What happened in those final moments, before the keys were turned and the doors were sealed, remained a terrible and immediate mystery. The forensic unit's arrival transformed the remote logging road from a peaceful stretch of wilderness into a concentrated, claustrophobic crime scene. The immediate objective was the interior of the Bronco, the capsule that held the final, tangible moments of the North Coast Five. What they found inside simultaneously answered a few questions and posed a host of new, infinitely darker ones. The initial inventory of the contents suggested an abrupt, unceremonious departure. Ethan's wallet, containing $60 cash and his driver's license, was in the center console. Clara's prescription sunglasses rested on the dashboard. A half-eaten bag of sour cream and onion chips lay spilled across the back seat, mere crumbs now against the dark upholstery, a mundane detail that spoke volumes of an interrupted moment. Crucially, the keys, usually an inseparable artifact of the driver, were absent. Had they been taken? Or had the owner kept them? A desperate attempt to return? The air inside the vehicle, when the crime scene technician first breached the passenger door seal, was stale but unremarkable, devoid of any overwhelming metallic tang of blood or the acrid smell of gunfire. This lack of obvious violence initially fueled the disastrously hopeful theory. Perhaps a minor car trouble had necessitated a short walk to find a farmhouse or gain a better signal. They had simply taken the keys and strayed. But the details, as they always do, began to argue against this comforting assumption. There were no backpacks, no camping gear, no sleeping bags, essential equipment for 5 people planning a trip into the deep wilderness. They had left everything of practical use behind, a decision that defied logic for seasoned campers. It suggested not a planned departure, but a forced, immediate one. Then came the discovery, a tiny detail that ripped the case wide open and plunged the investigative team into a state of chilling certainty. Tucked tightly beneath the passenger seat, almost invisible to the naked eye, was a piece of white fabric, small and roughly triangular. It was stiff, almost rigid, and dark crimson with dried matter. The investigators knew instantly this was the terrible story the Bronco had been trying to tell. A quick field test confirmed the obvious: human blood. The color and quantity were too stark to be a minor abrasion. This was the sign of a significant injury, a silent struggle played out in the small confines of the vehicle, a struggle that did not leave the external, dramatic scars of shattered windows or dented metal. Immediately, the vehicle became the singular focus of the entire operation. Every square inch was meticulously processed. The carpet fibers were collected, the door handles dusted, the seat fabric scraped. The critical task was the blood. It was immediately expedited to the lab, the investigators praying that it belonged to one of the 5 missing friends. If it was Maya's blood, or Liam's, it would at least confirm their status as victims and give the case a direction. But the lab results, when they finally came, delivered the first profound shock. The assumption, the very foundation of the case, was shattered. The blood was human, and the DNA profile was clean. It belonged to none of the North Coast Five. It was male. It belonged to an unknown entity, a ghost who had bled inside the abandoned Bronco. The terrifying story was now amplified. 5 friends had not simply vanished. They had been intimately involved in a violent incident with a 6th, unidentified person, a person who had been injured enough to leave a trail, but who was also, somehow, not among the disappeared. This introduced a new, darker variable, a predator, a potential assailant, who was now also a victim, or, at the very least, a fugitive. The quiet fear of a tragic accident was replaced by the cold, heavy realization that they were now hunting for a killer and potentially a 6th victim. The initial, contained mystery had exploded into something far more dangerous. The presence of the unidentified male blood demanded a complete pivot in the investigative approach. The missing persons case was now officially a criminal investigation, a fact that brought no comfort to the 5 waiting families. The focus returned to the white, blood-soaked piece of fabric, the most compelling piece of physical evidence recovered from the Bronco's interior. Under microscopic analysis, the weave of the cloth was identified, a heavy, coarse cotton that spoke of institutional use. Further testing against databases yielded a grim, specific match. The fabric was consistent with a standard-issue uniform from the nearby Olympic Correction Center, a medium-security facility nestled against the eastern edge of the forest. The fugitive theory, once a vague possibility, crystallized into a horrific certainty. A prison escapee, wounded, desperate, and dangerous, had encountered the unsuspecting North Coast Five. But the most confounding detail was yet to be fully appreciated: a piece of equipment found outside the vehicle, lying mere feet from the driver's side door. A broken CB radio antenna. This was not a minor component. It was a heavy-duty, 7-foot metal whip, snapped cleanly about a third of the way up. The laboratory examination of the break site was meticulous. The damage was not consistent with a vehicle collision or a tree branch strike. The metal showed telltale signs of being forcefully bent back and forth, a deliberate and powerful action, consistent with a struggle. The antenna was, in essence, a weapon or a tool used in a desperate confrontation. Why would a fugitive, injured and trying to escape, engage 5 young people on a remote logging road? The logic was chillingly simple: necessity. The logging roads were a labyrinth, a network of dead ends and treacherous terrain. To navigate them, particularly if wounded, one would need a map, supplies, or most critically, a vehicle. The Bronco, sitting there with its engine off, represented salvation for the escapee and damnation for the 5 friends. The confrontation, the investigators theorized, must have been swift and brutal. The escapee, now identified through a preliminary look at the correction facility's outstanding roster as a man named Silas Cain, a convicted burglar with a violent history, likely approached the vehicle, possibly under the guise of an accident victim or a lost hiker. The initial scenario was now reconstructed. The North Coast Five, displaying the empathy of youth, had stopped for Silas Cain. The blood was his, shed in the initial scuffle, perhaps while they were still attempting to help him. The broken antenna was a weapon used in defense or attack, snapped off during the struggle. But the sequence of events remained frustratingly unclear. Why were the doors locked after the incident? Why were there no struggle marks outside the car? And most damningly, if Cain was the initial victim, where were the 5 friends? The omniscient perspective of the investigation revealed the investigators' growing anxiety. They were dealing with an opponent whose actions defied the conventional logic of a simple roadside robbery or abduction. The investigation shifted its geographical focus, utilizing the last known coordinates from the cell tower ping and the location of the abandoned Bronco. Aerial photographs now captured a desperate, coordinated ground search. Hundreds of uniformed officers sweeping the immense, silent forest, a visual contrast between the small, contained tragedy of the vehicle and the vast, unfeeling expanse of the wilderness. The silence of that wilderness, once a symbol of peace, now felt like a blanket of complicity, hiding a horrific truth. Silas Cain had vanished, taking with him the answers and, more importantly, taking the North Coast Five. The new, darker line of inquiry was no longer if a crime had occurred, but how a single, desperate man had managed to subdue and disappear 5 young, strong adults without leaving a single witness or a single, simple explanation. The focus had moved from the abandoned car to the shadow of the man whose blood had stained its interior. The search for Silas Cain and the missing friends now stretched into its second week. The initial fervor had settled into a grim, methodical grind, the investigators battling not just the vastness of the Olympic National Forest, but the constant, crushing anxiety radiating from the families. They had followed every lead related to the fugitive, every rumor of a sighting, every potential route of escape. Yet, Cain remained a spectral presence, confirmed only by the genetic signature left on a small patch of cotton. The forest, a silent accomplice, offered up nothing but indifference, the towering trees mocking the human endeavor to find a trace of movement or life. Then, a stroke of terrible luck arrived in the form of a seasoned tracking team, deployed miles deeper into the forest, along a barely used deer trail that cut through a particularly dense ravine. There, nestled beneath a shallow rock overhang, they found a makeshift campsite. It was rudimentary, designed for survival, not comfort. A fire pit, long since cold, contained fragments of what appeared to be burned plastic. A rough bed of pine needles and woven branches suggested a prolonged stay, perhaps days or even a week. The site was abandoned, yet the silence of its vacancy was louder than any scream. Two objects recovered from the site provided the next, agonizing layer of the narrative. The first was a rusted hunting knife, its blade heavily corroded. Forensic analysis confirmed a faint, almost imperceptible trace of human blood on the handle. A mix, this time, of two distinct profiles. One belonged to Silas Kane. The other was an immediate, devastating match, Liam Donnelly. The realization struck the investigative team like a physical blow. The violence had not been confined to the quick roadside scuffle. It had extended into the heart of the forest, and at least one of the friends had been physically harmed. The initial hope, the thread that still clung to the notion of a safe release, was summarily severed. The second item was equally potent, but carried a deeper, more personal emotional weight. Shoved carelessly beneath a flat stone, as if discarded in haste or panic, was a silver pendant. It was a simple, elegant piece of jewelry, a delicate chain attached to a small, five-pointed star inset with a single, tiny sapphire. This was the North Star pendant that Clara Vance had worn every day since her 18th birthday, a gift from her mother, a sentimental anchor. The fact that it was found here, miles from the abandoned Bronco, not on her body, but hidden in the dirt of a fugitive's temporary camp, suggested a terrible, drawn-out ordeal. The discovery fundamentally changed the understanding of the timeline. Silas Kane had encountered the North Coast Five, sustained an injury, and, rather than fleeing to freedom, had taken the five friends deeper into the hostile environment. The motive had mutated from a simple need for a getaway vehicle into something far more sinister and prolonged. The rhetorical question that now haunted the lead investigator was devastating. Why hold five hostages when you were trying to escape? The answer, however unpalatable, pointed toward a pathology that transcended desperation. It suggested control, sadism, and a profound, terrifying lack of human empathy. The contrast between Clara's delicate silver pendant, a symbol of youthful hope and guidance, and the rusty, blood-stained knife of a violent fugitive spoke to the tragic, unimaginable collision of two worlds. The vast, empty forest had witnessed everything, and the only evidence it would surrender were these few, isolated fragments of a terrifying, protracted crime. The silence of the campsite was a profound confirmation of the investigators' deepest dread. The discovery of a North Star pendant and the mixture of blood on the hunting knife defined the final, relentless phase of the search. The investigators were no longer looking for five missing people. They were searching for a burial site, an inevitable conclusion driven by the pathological timeline now established. The new theory posited that Silas Kane, driven by a need to eliminate witnesses and secure his continued isolation, had executed the worst possible outcome. The vastness of the forest, once the primary obstacle, was now the primary canvas for the final, heartbreaking reveal. The final trace was not found by ground searchers, but by an analyst reviewing aerial thermal images captured days earlier during the initial, wider sweeps. A faint, almost missed anomaly was spotted in a rarely visited section of the forest, a small, unnatural depression in the earth near the base of an old-growth cedar, with a slightly elevated soil temperature. It was a disturbance in the otherwise pristine pattern of the forest floor, a place where the earth had been recently turned. The search team converged on the location, their dread now a tangible, physical presence. The silence at this final scene was different from the silence of the Bronco or the campsite. It was an absolute, heavy silence of finality. As the first layers of soil were carefully removed, the terrible certainty that had been building since the discovery of the blood-stained cloth was realized. The physical description of the recovered victims was a final, somber confirmation of the story told by the evidence. Ethan, Clara, Maya, Liam, and Owen, the North Coast Five, were together still, victims of a predatory encounter that had stolen not just their lives, but their futures. The method of their death, later confirmed through forensic pathology, spoke to a quick, brutal efficiency that was utterly devoid of human mercy. The subsequent manhunt for Silas Kane was brief, a formality played out against the backdrop of an already concluded tragedy. He was found 2 days later, attempting to hitchhike 50 miles south of the burial site, his face gaunt, his body bearing the scars of his initial struggle, the same wounds that had left his DNA in the Bronco. He offered no resistance, only a chilling, vacant stare that revealed nothing of the terror he had inflicted. The only statement he ever gave, an incoherent narrative of self-preservation and fear, only served to underscore the sheer injustice of the events. The terrifying story that the abandoned car had told was not about the tragedy that occurred within its four doors, but about the profound vulnerability of human innocence when it collides with pure, unmitigated desperation. The vehicle had been a beacon, a target, and a final, enclosed space of safety that was ultimately breached. It sat there, an enduring monument to the point where the carefree road trip ended and the dark, inescapable reality of the wilderness began. The five friends had set out looking for the majesty of the ancient trees, but they found only the ancient, unfeeling malice that can hide beneath their shade. The narrative of the North Coast Five, once a vibrant tale of youthful exploration, was now a grave historical account, a solemn warning about the deceptive silence of the forest and the cold, hard fact that sometimes the only thing more vast than the wilderness itself is the horror a single man can inflict within it. The case was closed, but the emotional weight, the feeling of dread and profound injustice, remains. The final image is one of the immense, indifferent wilderness, now forever marked by the spot where five bright lives were tragically and definitively extinguished. The memory of the North Coast Five is now etched into the silent history of the great Olympic forest.